ऊपर टच कर रहा था, इसीलिए नहीं हम छुपा।
चल चल अब आगे ना स्ट्रीम हो गई ना, दिख रही है तेरे को?
हाँ सर, हाँ एक सेकंड, तो मैं आपको वो भेज रहा हूँ, क्या नाम है,
जल्दी भेज, जल्दी जल्दी जल्दी।
लिंक आपको भेज रहा हूँ
व्हाट्सएप पे भेज मेरे को।
ठीक है, लाइव है सर सेशन।
लाइव है सेशन, तेरे को दिख रहा है ना? आवाज आ रही है? चलिए अब देखते हैं, इसमें शायद हो गया। हेलो हेलो,
हाँ हाँ सर।
कितने बच्चे नमन?
7 लोग हैं।
ठीक है, मैंने लिंक भेजा अभी, जरा कर दे सर्कुलेट उसको।
लाइक नहीं चल रहा है।
हाँ हाँ, यहाँ लिंक देख तो एक बार, तू एक बार लिंक खोल के देख, मुझे लाइव देख पा रहा है कि नहीं?
हाँ हाँ मैं कर रहा हूँ।
पहले तू लिंक खोल के देख, फिर
ठीक है ठीक है।
लिंक पहले तू खोल के देख, फिर मुझे बता लाइव आ पा रहा है कि नहीं।
हाँ हाँ हाँ।
आ रहा है?
हाँ 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 सर।
स्क्रीन और आवाज आ रही है ना अब?
हाँ
हाँ, अनम्यूट ही छोड़ दे, कोई दिक्कत नहीं है।
हाँ सर।
अब देख, आवाज आ रही है?
हाँ हाँ अब आ रही, अब आ रही।
स्क्रीन आ रही है?
हाँ हाँ अब
चल,
आ रही।
अब तू लिंक सर्कुलेट कर दे, मैं लाइव।
ठीक है ठीक
ठीक है, चल ओके।
है। ओ,
हाँ सर, हो गया। थैंक यू सर। इसका पेन कौन सा, ये वाला है ना? हाँ सर। Okay, a very good afternoon to all of you. Please confirm if the audio visual is clear. All the students who have joined in for the demo class, please confirm if the audio visual is clear on this one. I can read your chats if you can write over here. Naman, can you please confirm if the audio visual is clear so I can start? All right, so a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining the course, the live stream. All right, so we are starting today in a sense with a set of demo lectures on what is eventually supposed to be a course on the subject of political science and international relations with regard to the optional subject. That is the intention at which we are basically meeting today. Some of you are familiar with me. I may have taught the subject of polity, governance, or international relations to you. And today we are meeting to see how we can take forward a course on political science and international relations. So we have a series of demo lectures that we are interested in at this stage to help each other understand better as to how we can navigate a course like this in the set of timelines that we would want to prescribe. So we are going to give the details of the course properly. It is a proper full-fledged foundation course. On the optional subject of political science and international relations. And we're going to share the details and the technical points about how the course is supposed to run. What is the duration of the course? What are the time periods within which certain elements of the course are going to be covered, etc., etc. But that is going to be later on in our discussion. Today we want to have a bit of an understanding whether we can tune into a little bit of a subject as to how we can read and understand political science together. If that happens for you, only then you should feel convinced that you want to be a part of this entire exercise. So it is a kind of an initiation, it is a kind of an introduction to a particular teaching style that I would want to, present before you. What are the ways in which I would want to deal with different topics within the subject of political science, international relations, and how you can use this teaching style, the methodology of teaching, the pedagogy of teaching, and the overall environment of the classroom into writing the answers for your examination. That is basically what you should be able to gauge and judge if that is happening for you during these demo classes. And then if you feel convinced, you're welcome to join the course that we're offering here. So we can discuss the details of the course, etc., later on, once you have a bit of a conviction on that end. Okay, so we are going to take a very simple and initial understanding of how a subject of political science and international relations figures in the UPSC, right? And I'm not going to go into too much technical details as of now because I am assuming it that you have a sense of how the syllabus is structured in the UPSC notification, right? So when I take a look at the points that we're dealing with in PSIR, we can develop a bit of a diagrammatic format. You have a horizontal x-axis and you have a vertical y-axis, right? Now you have, for example, very simply, that there are two papers within political science. Every optional has two papers. You have paper 1 and you have paper 2. These are the two papers in the subject of political science, right? And at the same time, each of these papers has a section A and a section B. So we're looking at something like this. You have section A of paper 1, and you have section B of paper 1. Similarly, you will have a section A of paper 2, and you will have a section B of paper 2. This is how basically you can understand the logic by which the subject of political science is given a design in the UPSC syllabus. So you have paper 1 and paper 2, two papers, and each paper has a section A and a section B. So paper 1, section A and section B. Paper 2, section A and section B. Right? And if you take a look at a bit of a simple understanding of how this is divided, you know that paper 1, section A, talks about the understanding of what is known as political theory and thought. Which is what you can say is a philosophical part of the examination. Right? And in the recent years, as the questions are coming from this part of the syllabus for the political science, the questions from political theory and political thought are possibly slightly difficult in nature, because what the paper or the examiner who's setting up the paper is doing is they're combining contemporary issues with the ideas of political theorists. So, for example, how is Locke's Treaty on Liberty relevant in the current geopolitical scenario? You see, so that kind of a infusion of political theory in terms of understanding the contemporary national and international political phenomenon is being used by the examiner to construct questions in the section A of paper number 1 for the UPSC. You see, that is where we are. And similarly, if you take a look at the other part, which is section 2 or section B of paper number 1, you have, let's say, for very simple terms, you can define it as the fact that the politics underlying the Indian institutions. Very simply, if I want to make a relevant around it, it is about the politics underlying the Indian institutions. Right? Here you have a range of subjects which deal not only with the subjects which are developed in the Indian institutions. For example, you have the Constitution of India, which is the birthplace of all the institutions. You have the Parliament, you have the Supreme Court, you have different organizations, you have constitutional bodies like the CAG or the Election Commission of India. You have statutory bodies like the National Commission for Women, National Commission for Minorities, and you have non-statutory bodies like the Planning Commission, Niti Aayog, etc., etc. How are these institutions kept in the framework of Indian politics? That's basically the kind of questions that you get from this particular part. Questions are generally focused upon the subjects of the Constitution of India and the directive principles of state policies, which are fundamental rights, etc. And you have the role of the Supreme Court and all of that. So that's going to be the political angle of the Indian institutional framework, as we can see in the section B of paper number 2, right? And then when we take a look at paper number 3, the most important component of paper number 3 is not national politics, but it has a lot of coverage of what is known as international politics. And also it has some contemporary political issues from India itself. So what we basically study in paper number 2 in section A and section B, and I'll go to the details later on because we are not doing a proper examination of the syllabus at this stage. The kind of questions that you get from paper number 2. Okay, I think we are back. Have voice, please can someone come on the message. Sorry, I didn't realize that we had a little bit of an audio issue. Great. Okay, so I'll just repeat it once. When we take a look at the two parts which are given here, one you have kind of political theory and thought that to what's known as national politics. The very simple subject of political theory and thought for PSIR. When we take an understanding of political theory and thought for PSIR, we see two aspects. One is in paper number 1, which talks about nation states, which means that there has to be a state formation question, the question of forming a government within a particular nationality, within a particular geography, right? They are talking about what are known as nation states. And when we talk about political theory and thought in paper number 2, we are talking about what are known as international politics. How nation states interact with each other. Right. So for example, if we study, let's say for instance, Aristotle over here, the parts of Aristotle that we'll study over here is that how in a particular geography, a particular state can be formed. How in one particular geography, in one particular territory, and over a particular set of people, a state can be formed. And what are the virtues of that state? What are the attributes of that state? What are the kinds of constitution that the state can and must adopt? But when we talk about this part in terms of political theory, here we'll ask the question as to how did Aristotle, for example, talks about the relationship of international actors. How do these people come together in terms of creating a global political atmosphere? How does one country relate to other country? What are the terms of war and peace? What is the nature of sovereignty? What kind of relations can you expect in an international scenario? What is the nature of anarchy in a global political order? Those are the kind of theoretical questions that you will be facing in this part, which is paper number 2. You see, so you have the same idea that you have to study political theory and thought. But political theory and thought has to be understood in 2 dimensions. Number 1, you have to see how political theory should be understood to inform national ideas of a nation, of a people within a particular circumscribed territory, under a particular government, within the framework of a particular constitution. On the other hand, when we take a look at political theory and thought for paper number 2, we have to deal with how different nations with their states create a kind of a synchronization or cooperation or coexistence or war or invasion or understanding the terms of sovereignty with each other. That is going to be the way which one can see how political theory, etc., is going to be relevant in these scenarios. So I'm just giving you an example as to how the interpretation of the syllabus can be made. You think about political theory and thought, and you have the national political theory, and you have the international political theory. And you may have, let's say for example, you may read Karl Marx as to what should happen within a particular nation. So he did not believe in the concept of a nation as such, but nonetheless, his application always happened in certain countries. USSR was a nation which was developed on the Marxist principle. So is China. So you're looking at Marxism which is happening within a particular territory. But at the same time, if you look at the Marxist view of international relations, we have to see how Marx has to become relevant in terms of describing the kinds of nature of interactions that nation states can do with each other in an international scenario. You see, that's the logic that we want to kind of communicate in terms of 1 and reading Marx for paper number 2. Right? So just a bit of a example of how that has to be, settled out. Similarly, you have the remaining parts, section B and section B of paper number 1 and section B of paper number 2 are both slightly contemporary, right? So in this you read about what are known as the, politics underlying the Indian institutions, right? What is the nature of liberalism in the Indian constitution? What is the nature of judicial independence in the context of the Indian Supreme Court? These are examples that have been in this particular part. And here you see a kind of a modified version of what is known as contemporary international relations. Meaning, the question is, what kind of a relationship does the Indian, or let's say Indian foreign policy, have with the the remainder of the world? So you have to think of it as an expanded and a modified and a more, let's say, a detailed version of the international relations subject in the GS paper number 2. Right? So that's how you can see the syllabus. You can see the syllabus in 2 fragments. Number 1, you have paper 1, section A, and paper 2, section A, which deal with political theory and thought for national and international politics. And then you can look at section B of paper 1 and section B of paper 2 as contemporary national issues and as contemporary international issues. You see, that's basically where you can see India and the world, Indian foreign policy and its relationship with the nations outside India, and what are the political underpinnings of the institutions within the territory of India. That's how basically you can simply understand the structure of how this is for the political science international relations options. Right? Now that's just a very brief kind of a demonstration as to how we will spend at least 2 classes breaking down each point in the syllabus using a particular mathematical formula, so that you have a very clear understanding as to what mindset you have to adopt while attempting different parts of the examination. What kind of a thinking cap you need to have for answering questions in paper number 1, section A, paper number 2, section B, paper number 1, section B, and paper number 2, section A. How do you change your mindsets and perspective into answering these questions? Because it has to be given a certain conditioning and all that. So my very simple idea is to discuss the syllabus in detail once we start the classes, in terms of understanding as to how this can be structured in a proper manner. Okay, so that's just a bit of a introductory point on how this remark can be made. But in addition to this, today I want to spend some time in giving you an understanding of how a classroom program will unfold while we look at the subject of international relations from an academic point of view. Okay, so let's just see this how. I can take one, for example, topic today, and we will take a look at a few questions from the previous year papers on PSIR. The approach is very simple. My intention is to ensure that everything that we read inside the classroom is immediately, not without any break, converted into answer writing. Right? Answer writing is going to be an integral part of the classroom session. We will cover 5 years of previous year questions inside the classroom entirely. As we complete one particular topic, for example, if we complete Thomas Hobbes or John Locke's theory of liberty, in the same classroom, you will be given previous year questions to write answers out of. And we'll discuss these questions and evaluate your answers. So the very simple structure and strategic point about the classroom is that everything that you read and everything that you learn has to immediately transform into answer writing. It cannot wait. You cannot merely have a test series after the classrooms are done, or just a monthly test. It will not suffice. Unless you immediately develop the ability to write answers upon the topics that you're covering in the examination, you will not feel confident to be able to take up a subject like that. And some of you may be aware of this style of teaching because you have completed the subject of polity or international relations, as to how after each class we give a set of questions, and those questions are expected to be answered then and there, not after the subject is over. We don't think of a subject as one big thing which has to be covered first and then we can arrive at answer writing. We don't do that. We take it each classroom wise. In every classroom, we will cover one subject, one topic, and within that coverage, we'll be able to write answers of that topic. So these small points, these small units have to aggregate together to complete your preparation. We can't do a monolithic coverage of the entire syllabus first and then come to write the answers. That is not a good approach in terms of developing our cognitive abilities to be able to produce answers in the paper. And that is the final consequence and the real motivation for all of us here. You should be able to write good answers which get you good marks in the subject. Okay, so that's the overall strategy and approach we will work with. And some of you may be familiar with this style of teaching because you have already taken classes in polity and IR, so you know how we do that in the classroom session. Just that in this part, I will have the liberty and the ability to give a personal understanding and personal supervision as to how your answer writing has to unfold. Because that's the nature of this course, but at this stage. Okay. Now, if you take a look at this part, let's say, today I want to take a bit of a point in terms of understanding a area of questions, right? There are areas of questions which have come in the UPSC main examination from what are known as the relationship of fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy. Fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy. Right? You have a question from the 2014 main examination, in the PSIR on this part. So we would want to, in a way, try to develop a kind of a demo on how we would want to cover a subject or a topic like this in the classroom session. Right? And of course, you have to understand that this is the subject of political science. So naturally, there has to be some kind of a relevance of the politics that happens between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policies. Some of you who are aware of this, they are basically talking about the Indian political scenario in the 1970s, which is underlined by the Act of Emergency. But not only emergency, some of you know that there were very, very crucial amendments made to the Constitution during this time. But all of them have a political background to them. You have the 24th and 25th Constitution Amendment Act 1971. And then you have the mighty 42nd Constitution Amendment Act 1976. You see, and in the middle of this you had other amendments also. For example, you had the 39th Constitution Amendment Act 1975. So these are the features on which we have to base our understanding of this particular topic. ऐसा क्या हुआ था 1970 के दशक में भारत की राजनीति में, जिससे कि संविधान के कुछ प्रावधानों के बीच में एक प्रकार का फ्रिक्शन क्रिएट कर दिया गया था. एक तरफ you had the concept of individual rights or the liberal ideals of the Constitution. Now please note that the concept of individual right and the concept of the liberal ideas of the Indian Constitution is a political theory concept. It's not a legal concept. You see, it does not relate to the subject of law, but of the political science, the political theory. So when we think about, let's say, for example, the concept of liberalism, as liberalism has been evolved in both the Indian and the Western tradition. So for example, we talk of the theory of Thomas Hobbes, we talk about theory of John Locke, we talk of theory of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and even some contemporary liberal thinkers like Hannah Arendt. These are the political ideas which became the frameworks or the values which created the codification of fundamental rights, which is mentioned in part 3 of the Constitution. Right? So we can say very simply that the legally and constitutionally enforceable rights which are given inside part 3 of the Constitution, which are known as the fundamental rights, eventually have a liberal foundation in political theory. And then you very clearly have certain very associated thinkers to liberal theory in political science. You have, as I mentioned, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, but also you have a lot of political thinkers associated in the Indian tradition. Right? For example, certain interpretations give an understanding of how Sri Aurobindo was a liberal thinker. So when we take a look at this part of the subject in which we deal with Indian institutions which are in a way associated with the background of political science, how fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy have to be read for the subject of political science, is to understand the background of the political ideas and the political events. Right? So on one hand, you have part 3 of the Constitution, which talks about fundamental rights, which are individual rights, which is the subject of liberalism, because liberalism is a political theory that talks about the fact of the individual being the core unit of a society, and the society comes second and individual comes first. Society is nothing but an aggregation of individuals, is what the liberal thought would say. Society can break down, but the individuals cannot. So individuals can form, reform or unform societies, but individuals cannot be subsumed by societies. This is the kind of European, liberal interpretation of these ideas. And the way that this logic has been encoded into a constitutionally enforceable topic is where we get the fundamental rights. So in a way, what I'm doing is I'm creating an association between fundamental rights and liberal theories in political science. You see how the structure of fundamental rights has to be seen and understood in the subject of political science from a liberal perspective. That's the point that we have to focus on. Right. At the same time, if you take a look at directive principles of state policy, now, directive principle of state policy in part 4 of the Constitution, by their nature, do not address the individual or the liberty of one person, but the collective good of the society. You see, they are not points which are made for the emancipation of the individual from the society, unlike the fundamental rights. एक व्यक्ति विशेष का समाज के हाथों से किसी प्रकार का किसी अंकुश ना लगाया जाए. That is what is given in fundamental rights. लेकिन directive principle of state policy में our subject is not the individual but the society, the welfare of the society at large, the welfare of the collective, the welfare of the masses. And therefore the political theory and political idea which is at the foundation of directive principle of state policy to some extent is socialism, to some extent is what you can call a collectivism, to some extent is the idea of a welfare state which works for the benefit of the masses in the society. Do you see the point? So what are we basically getting a sense over here? We're understanding the point that the points which are given inside the Constitution, if you take a look at, for example, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, Parliament, Supreme Court, constitutional bodies like the Election Commission, etc. All these institutions of the Indian Republic, they have a political background, they have a political foundation, they have a political thought, a political theory. And when we study this part of the subject, in which we talk about Indian institutions and their political background, we see how the ideas of political theory and political thought have created these institutions, and to what extent can these institutions live up to these ideas, right? That dynamism, that interaction between the Supreme Court as a protector of fundamental rights, being a liberal court, is to be understood in the subject of political science when we're reading about the Supreme Court. You see, so the kind of perception we develop towards the Supreme Court of India in the subject of political science is about how the Supreme Court of India is fundamentally supposed to be upholding the liberal values of the Indian Constitution, the protector of liberty, the final guardian of individual, the great emancipator of the individual freedoms. These are the titles which are given to the Supreme Court in describing its. Sometimes the Supreme Court judges themselves give these titles to them to, in a way, define and describe their role in the Indian Republic. You see, so these are all the language and vocabulary of political science and political thought, which are to be used in understanding Indian institutional frameworks. And that is what we have to focus upon. And when we are going to study these ideas, certainly we are going to study the political events which happened in India alongside this practical application. So the question very simply is, 1970s में ऐसा क्या हुआ था? What happened in 1970s? That the subject of fundamental rights, which is a liberal idea, and subject of directive principle of state policy, which is a collectivist idea, came at loggerheads with each other. This is a set of ideas interacting with each other. But of course, as Hegel says, ideas are just a reflection of reality, or the real is the rational is the real. Reality is just a reflection of the idea. So in ideal terms, or in ideational terms, you have socialism and liberalism conflicting with each other in the 1970s. But in factual terms, you have the government of India and the Parliament of India represented by Indira Gandhi, and you have the fundamental rights represented by the Supreme Court entering into a struggle for power and dominance with each other. You see what we are constructing over here? We're looking at two political ideas confronting with each other, and these two political ideas are represented in a factual confrontation between two institutions, perhaps between two individuals. Justice H.R. Khanna from the Supreme Court on one end, possibly, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi from the government of India on the other hand. So these events and these ideas have to be understood holistically to get a sense of the relationship between the subjects of directive principles of state policy on one hand and fundamental rights on the other hand. Where the government of India in 1970s claimed that it is the final representative of the people of India, and individual interests cannot come in the way of the realization of the masses. Individual interests cannot come in the middle of social upliftment of the collective, upliftment of the people. This is very clearly a political language which gives a prominence to society over individuals. That is what basically Indira Gandhi represented in 1970s, right? And she used the subject of directive principle of state policy to give a constitutional justification to that. You see the point? And on the other hand, the Supreme Court again and again made judgments and statements that it is supposed to be the protector of the fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are a part of the basic feature of the Constitution. Emancipation of the individual from the society is the greatest goal of the Constitution of India. Supreme Court giving itself the power to be the protector of the individual against the tyranny of the collective, against the overwhelming hand of the collective over the individual. You see? So in one simple order, you can see how ideas conflict with each other or cooperate with each other, how institutions conflict or cooperate with each other, and how powerful individuals in a society conflict or cooperate with each other. Unless we understand this holistic framework, we are not going to be able to write answers of political science, that is for sure. And that's the exact proposition inside a classroom, that one has to understand this holistically. One has to understand this in a manner in which the factual history of directive principle versus fundamental rights are to be covered in the classroom. The nature of institutions, the Supreme Court and the Parliament, have to be covered in the classroom. And the political ideas of liberty and socialism has to be covered in the classroom. And the constitutional points of fundamental rights and directive principles have to be covered in the classroom. All these 4 points have to be woven together inside the classroom as a storyline. And then only when you understand this great theater of Indian political discourse will you develop the ability to understand the topic clearly, and you can write answers without subjecting yourself to rote revision. Rote memorization, rote revision is what we are trying to avoid in classes like this. Of course, I always say that some amount of rote is necessary. रटना important है, लेकिन बिना समझे आप रट नहीं पाएंगे. Once you understand the story of Indian politics and the story of socialism versus liberalism, story of Supreme Court versus Parliament, story of Indira Gandhi versus judges of the Supreme Court, story of directive principles of state policy versus fundamental rights. Unless you understand that part inside the classroom, and you have a very clear categorical set of notes upon what that is, you are not going to be able to memorize those notes. So memorization without understanding is impossible, and understanding without memorization is futile. We have to find a way to combine both of them. But the classroom session is where we participate in making you understand. Memorization is, of course, your own individual capacity and choice as to how you do it, but you will have to do it in some sense or the other. Okay, so just take a bit of an understanding of how we can, convert this into a point of learning. Let's take a point about how questions can be covered from reading the directive principles of state policy. Okay, so just 1 second, if I can pull out a question from the 2024 paper. Take a look at a question like this. Now, just to be sure if you have an understanding from references. This is the Civil Services Main Examination 2024. This is the paper of Political Science and International Relations. And this is paper 1, right? And in paper 1, we're looking at section B. And in section B, we take a look at this question. Please take a look at this question once. And we'll see how we can develop the understanding of a subject so that, of course, you're able to answer a question like this. You see, please, if you can just take a look at the question here. You had a similar question on the same lines in 2021 also. I'll show you that question also. Now, take a look at the question. How far do you agree that directive principle of state policy are more fundamental than the fundamental rights in meeting the socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? That's a very beautifully drafted question. And as is characteristic of the UPSC, each word inside the question has a very clear specific meaning to it. कुछ भी ऐसे फालतू में नहीं लिखा है इस क्वेश्चन के अंदर. Everything which is used in this question has a specific indication as to what it wants in the answer. Okay, so let's do it once. How far do you agree that the directive principle of state policy are more fundamental than the fundamental rights in meeting the socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? Right? Now, I was just giving you a bit of a sense of this as to how the fundamental rights are more associated with the principles of what are known as liberalism. What does liberalism mean? Liberalism mean, in a sense, emancipation of the individual, empowerment of the individual, saving the individual from the society. व्यक्ति विशेष को समाज के बंधनों से आजादी दिलाना. You know the heroic words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his discourse on inequality. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in shackles. Man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. व्यक्ति जो इस धरती पे आता है, in terms of his individuality, is born free. But it is the society that chains a man into different norms and customs and regulations and laws and procedures and disciplines. You see? So that's a very categorical liberal statement. And fundamental rights talk about liberty of the individual from the society, security of the individual from the society, non-participation in the individual of the society. But directive principle of state policy are exactly the opposite when they talk about not the individual but the society. Socio-economic justice, the justice for the masses, justice for the society, not for the individual. Right? So as justice is described in the preamble, it has three components: political, social, and economic. Please make sure that political justice is not given over here, because political justice is more clearly associated with liberalism. Only social and economic justice is given over here because it is associated with the directive principle of state policy. And to some extent, you can see that it corresponds with the political ideology of socialism. Some may say the idea of collectivism, and of course the well-formed political idea or what is known as a welfare state, एक कल्याणकारी राज्य जो कि समाज के लोगों के कल्याण के लिए काम करता है. It's like a monarch, a king who works for the benefit of the masses. You see, not of the individual necessarily. अगर इंडिविजुअल का बेनिफिट हो रहा है मासेस के साथ तो ठीक है, लेकिन मासेस का बेनिफिट इसीलिए नहीं रुकेगा कि किसी इंडिविजुअल के लिए वो उसकी फंडामेंटल राइट का कॉम्प्रोमाइज है. जैसे सिंपल अगर आप इसका उदाहरण ले तो यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड, व्हिच इज अ वेरी ओपन क्वेश्चन टुडे. यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड अगर आपको पता है तो वो डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी के अंदर दे रखा है. अब जाहिर है कि अगर आप सामान नागरिक संहिता अगर लेके आएंगे, मतलब इसका मतलब है कि सारे जो पर्सनल लॉज हैं वो हर व्यक्ति के लिए समान होंगे. डाइवोर्स के क्या लॉज होंगे, इनहेरिटेंस के क्या लॉज होंगे, प्रॉपर्टी डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन के क्या लॉज होंगे, लिव इन रिलेशंस के क्या लॉज होंगे, मैरिज के कौन से फॉर्म्स एक्सेप्टेबल होंगे, बाइगेमी और पॉलीगेमी अलाउड होगी कि नहीं होगी. ये प्रश्न डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी में पूछा गया है. और यूनिफॉर्मिटी का मतलब है कि हर व्यक्ति के ऊपर एक प्रकार का लॉ लगाया जाएगा, किसी व्यक्ति के बीच में भेद नहीं किया जाएगा. अब जाहिर है कि यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड एज अ कॉन्सेप्ट इटसेल्फ इज एंटीथेटिकल टू फंडामेंटल राइट्स, क्योंकि फंडामेंटल राइट्स say that individual can decide for himself or herself what he wants to do in his personal matters. मैं अपनी प्रॉपर्टी अपने बच्चों को देना चाहता हूँ या नहीं देना चाहता हूँ, ये मेरा व्यक्तिगत मैटर है अकॉर्डिंग टू फंडामेंटल राइट्स. बट यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड के अनुसार मुझे कुछ हिस्सा अपनी प्रॉपर्टी का अपने बच्चों को देना ही पड़ेगा, whether I like it or not. So as you can see very clearly, it is not difficult to see how fundamental rights can be at conflict with directive principle of state policy, or how liberalism can be in conflict with what is good for the society, what is good for the collective, what is good for the nation, and how a uniform civil code can be in conflict with Article 21 and Article 14 of the Constitution. You see the order which I am creating, and of course I'm not able to, because we are just doing a demo class, I'm not giving you a proper structural understanding of it, but I'm just trying to communicate to you an idea how you are supposed to think about it. And of course in the classroom our attempt is going to convert this idea into proper written notes so that you have a structural chart, you have proper points that you can write about how EPSP versus FR is UCC versus 21 and 14, and how liberalism versus collectivism or socialism or even nationalism, right? So we'll give a proper form and codification to these ideas, but that is not what we can do right now. My point at this stage is to see if you can get the sense of these ideas, right, in the classroom session. That's basically what we are aiming at this stage. So if you take a look at the question again, how far do you agree that the directive principles of state policy are more fundamental than the fundamental rights in meeting socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? So basically they're saying something very simple, that the principal political goal, or let's say theoretical goal of directive principle of state policy is to provide justice to the society, not to the individual. Elaborate, that's the question. And also elaborate that in comparing directive principle of state policy to fundamental rights. Meaning they want you to give an answer in political terms in which you say that fundamental rights are essentially a liberal concept and directive principle of state policy are essentially a collective concept. And therefore, it is much more possible for directive principle of state policy to think about socio-economic justice. But if you take a look at other values of the preamble, for example, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship, these values are better protected by fundamentals. So you see, again, I'll just take 1 minute and ask you to focus on the terms of the question. इस प्रश्न के हर एक शब्द को आप गौर से देखिए और just see how beautifully the question is drafted into making you answer it in the format in which it is important to have the political theory understanding of this background. You see, fundamental rights are not necessarily created for the upliftment of the society, but for the emancipation of the individual. And therefore, they are not the values in the Constitution which are extremely important for socio-economic justice, but they are important for individual liberty. एक व्यक्ति का समाज से बंधनों को तोड़ देना या बंधनों से बाहर निकल के अपनी खुद की आत्मीयता को रियलाइज करना, ये फंडामेंटल राइट्स का एम है. समाज का उद्धार करना फंडामेंटल राइट्स का एम नहीं. समाज का उद्धार करना, समाज का कल्याण करना, सामाजिक न्याय प्राप्त करना डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी का एम. Right, that's the point. See, now I hope with this kind of a bit of a point you can understand the logic with which you have to approach the question. Do you see the point here? And please, and let me be clear, I am not at this stage going in the structure of the question or how you have to write the point-wise point answer to this question. That I will do separately and as properly as it is going to be. You are going to be given proper notes on these points, which you can memorize after you have understood them. But right now, just focus upon getting this spirit of the question, spirit of the idea as to how this question came up in the mind of the examiner and what is he expecting you to write in the answer. Right? So this question is incomplete without a mention of liberalism, without a mention of socialism, without a mention of collectivism. And then you have to find out the parts and directive principle of state policy. Recently, there is a judgment of the Supreme Court also, which talks about Article 39, Clause B and C, as to the fact whether the state can take control of private resources under Article 39 B and C for socio-economic justice. Abhi question, थोड़े दिन पहले Supreme Court का judgment आया. That also we can write in an answer like this. And of course, we can quote Article 38 and Article 39, which talk about the fact that the resources of the community must be so distributed as to realize the common good, which in a way hints towards socialism, hints towards the benefit of the society. तो ये आपको लिखना पड़ेगा इस आंसर में इन पॉइंट्स को, जिससे कि आपको नंबर मिल पाए. सिमिलरली फंडामेंटल राइट्स में Article 21, Article 14, Article 19, which are all liberal ideas, have to be written. And that is going to be the text of the answer. But we are not going there right now. I'm just trying to communicate to you an idea. How to metamorphose this idea, how to codify this idea into answer writing is going to be again a part of the classroom. But that we'll have to wait till we get to the classes on these things. Right? So let's take a look at this part very simply. If I come to the understanding of the Constitution of India, just 1 second, if I can pull out the copy of the Constitution of India. The point is, what all can we take from the Constitution of India? Second. What all can we take from the Constitution of India, which becomes a part of our answer writing in this thing? मतलब what all can we quote और cite? Keywords क्या होंगे इसमें जो हम डायरेक्टली लिख सकते हैं इस आंसर को एनरिच करने के लिए? What is the answer? Very simply, फंडामेंटल राइट्स में सारे लिबरलिज्म के कॉन्सेप्ट हैं. आपको पता है आर्टिकल 21 व्हाट इट सेज. आर्टिकल 21 प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ लाइफ एंड पर्सनल लिबर्टी. No person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. Article 19, which talks about right to freedom of speech and expression. All citizens shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression, association, assembly, movement, residence, livelihood, etc. Right? And if you take a look at the parts of directive principle of state policy which we have to write in this answer, you take a look simply at what are known as the Article 38 and Article 39 of the Constitution. Right? Let's take a look at Article 39. Certain principles of policy to be followed by the state. That the ownership and control of the material resources of the community are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. Right. Now you read this part, Article 39, Clause B of the Constitution, and you associate this with this question very simply. How far do you agree with the directive principle of state policy are fundamental in meeting the socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? You see how you have to write answers to things like these. Right? It talks about the ownership and control of the material resources of the community are so distributed as to subserve the common good. That the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production to the common detriment. Please read this once, just slightly focus upon the language of this. And we're preparing the content to write an answer like this. You see? (39) and C, and of course we have a recent judgment of the Supreme Court, 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court. The last judgment that the previous Chief Justice of India, Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, before he retired, he gave the judgment on 39B and C. Okay, so that's another content that we can write in an answer like this. Take a look at this, 38. The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political shall inform all the institution of the national life. To read the title, State to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. So think about it very simply. I would just invite you once, very simply, एक बार आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 1, 38 क्लॉज 2 को एक बार बस थोड़ा सा पढ़ लीजिए. डोंट बी बॉदर्ड डिटेलिंग ऑफ इट. बट इसके आइडिया को एक बार पकड़ने की कोशिश करिए। 38 क्लॉज 1 और 38 क्लॉज 2 की शब्दावली को थोड़ा सा समझने की कोशिश करिए। और आपने अगर 38 पढ़ लिया तो 39 के बी और सी को पढ़िए। है ना? Now let's see how we can come to this point. Take a look at this part. How far do you agree that the directive principles of state policy are more fundamental than fundamental rights in meeting socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? है ना? ये क्वेश्चन है आपका 20 नंबर का क्वेश्चन है। ठीक, अब मान के चलिए इसका अगर हमको आंसर लिखना है, देखिए ध्यान से। Let's say, how do we make an answer to this? We say, let's say, introduction. क्या लिखेंगे आप इंट्रोडक्शन में? बहुत सिंपल तरीके से, पार्ट 3 of the Constitution is inspired by liberalism. What is liberalism? A political idea. अब आपका पॉलिटिकल साइंस का आंसर बनेगा यस, अन्यथा क्वेश्चन जीएस का बन जाएगा अगर आप इसका आंसर सिर्फ वही लिख के आएंगे जो कि आपने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में पढ़ा है। कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का आंसर नहीं लिखना है, पॉलिटिकल साइंस का आंसर लिखना है, पेपर पॉलिटिकल साइंस का। क्या लिखेंगे? पार्ट 3 इज इन्फॉर्म्ड बाय द वैल्यू ऑफ लिबरलिज्म, और उसके साथ साथ आप लिख सकते हैं लिबरलिज्म हैज सर्टेन theorists associated with him. You see, the liberal political thought, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. To some extent, you can add Indian aspects also. Ambedkar लिख सकते हैं, Ambedkar was fundamentally a liberal. You see, तो एक चीज हमने ये लिखी, तुमने क्या लिखा? Part 3 of the Constitution, fundamental rights, is informed by the concept of liberalism as proposed in theories of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and Locke. ये आपका एक पार्ट हो गया, कीवर्ड्स आ गए सारे आपके आंसर। ठीक है, उसके बाद आप क्या लिखेंगे? पार्ट 4 इंट्रोडक्शन लिख रहे हैं हम सिर्फ, is informed by the values of socialism and also to some extent collectivism. And then you can see very simply that how there are certain socialist or collectivist thinkers. There are elements of Marxism. There are elements of what are known as Fabian socialism. ये एक political theory का part बन सकता है. There are elements of, let's say for example, the idea of a welfare state. तो ये आपने इंट्रोडक्शन तैयार कर दिया। आपने मतलब एक तरह से एक पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी के बेसिस का कंपैरेटिव एनालिसिस दे दिया फंडामेंटल राइट्स में और डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी। इतना सारा कंटेंट आप इंट्रोडक्शन में डाल देंगे, आपके पास इतने सारे कीवर्ड्स आ गए इंट्रोडक्शन के अंदर, इस इंट्रोडक्शन को कोई रिजेक्ट नहीं कर सकता। देखिए इसको एक बार, क्वेश्चन, हाउ फार डू यू अग्री दैट डीपीएसपी are more fundamental than fundamental rights? So before answering the body, matlab before answering the demand of the question, we simply introduce the 2 points of directive principles and fundamental rights. But we give a political science based introduction to these topics, not a polity based introduction. Okay, don't say article this to this is fundamental rights and article this to this is directive principle of state policy. ये नहीं लिखना है आपको, वो आपका polity में लिखना है। आपको यूज करने टर्म्स लिबरलिज्म और लिबरल थिंकर्स के नाम देने हैं। आपको यूज करना है टर्म सोशलिज्म और कलेक्टिविज्म और वेलफेयर स्टेट और थिंकर्स के नाम देने हैं। ये आपका इंट्रोडक्टरी पॉइंट है, ठीक राइट। अब उसके बाद अगर इंट्रोडक्शन में अगर आप वी हैव डन इंट्रोडक्शन, इफ वी कम टू द बॉडी पार्ट, लेट्स से हाउ वी राइट द बॉडी, okay, so what are we going to take a look at it in understanding this part? Very simply, think about it like this. आपको ये बताना है कि फंडामेंटल राइट्स और डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी में किस प्रकार की वैल्यूज को प्रमोट किया गया है और इन वैल्यूज के बीच में डिफरेंसेस क्या है। जैसे हमने ऑलरेडी बता दिया कि फंडामेंटल राइट लिबरलिज्म है और डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी सोशलिज्म है, तो आपको यहाँ पर यू हैव टू गिव एग्जांपल्स ऑफ इट। जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल आप क्या लिखेंगे, आर्टिकल 21 ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, आर्टिकल 19 ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एंड इवन फॉर एग्जांपल आर्टिकल 14 ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन डील्स विद द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ लिबर्टी। Then you can also say that the preamble also talks about liberty or individualism. As you know, preamble says liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship. तो आपका एक कंटेंट तो फंडामेंटल राइट्स के लिए आ गया। अब आप मेन पॉइंट पे आएंगे डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी। अब यहां लिखेंगे कि डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी आर नॉट इन्फॉर्म्ड बाय द वैल्यूज ऑफ लिबर्टी बट बाय द वैल्यूज ऑफ सोशलिज्म, है ना। सोशलिज्म, सोशल जस्टिस, वेलफेयर स्टेट, ये सारी चीजें आप पहले लिख चुके इंट्रोडक्शन में। अब यहां पर आप क्या लिखेंगे, व्हाट आई वांट टू राइट इन दिस पार्ट, वेरी सिंपली आर्टिकल, पे शुरू करते हैं वेरी सिंपली। प्रियम्बल टॉक्स अबाउट जस्टिस विच इज सोशल, इकोनॉमिक एंड पॉलिटिकल, आप ये लिखेंगे पहले, ठीक। उसके बाद आप लिखेंगे आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 1 टॉक्स अबाउट अगेन सोशल जस्टिस, इट इज द ड्यूटी ऑफ द स्टेट टू इंश्योर सोशल जस्टिस। देखिए एक बार आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 1 हमने क्या पढ़ा था, The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic and political shall inform all the institutions of the national life, है ना। तो हमने लिख दिया यहाँ पर आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 1 टॉक्स अबाउट सोशल जस्टिस, क्लियर। और इसके साथ आप चाहें तो वेलफेयर स्टेट भी लिख सकते हैं। आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 2 टॉक्स अबाउट reducing and eliminating inequalities, which is again a point about social justice. ये बोलता है आर्टिकल 38 क्लॉज 2, रिड्यूसिंग एंड एलिमिनेटिंग इनइक्वालिटीज। मटेरियल आ गया आपके पास लिखने के लिए आंसर, देखिए 38 क्लॉज 2, द स्टेट शैल इन पर्टिकुलर स्ट्राइव टू मिनिमाइज द inequalities in income and endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities and opportunities, not only among individuals but also among group of people residing in different areas or engaged in different vocations। ठीक है, इंडिविजुअलिज्म से नेचुरली इनइक्वालिटी क्रिएट होगी, क्योंकि इंडिविजुअल में अगर आप किसी और से अच्छे हो तो आपका अधिकार है उससे ज्यादा अपने हाथ में रखना रिसोर्सेस को। और लिबरलिज्म का कॉन्सेप्ट इकोनॉमिक टर्म्स में यही है कि मार्केट को खुला छोड़ दीजिए, जिसके पास भी कैपेबिलिटी होगी उसको पूंजी इकट्ठा करने दीजिए क्योंकि उसके पास कैपेबिलिटी है। अननेसेसरी समानता इंपोज मत करिए, समानता होगी तो आ जाएगी, नहीं होगी तो जैसा है वैसा ठीक है। लेकिन सोशलिज्म में ऐसा नहीं है, या सोशल जस्टिस में ऐसा नहीं है, या फिर वेलफेयर स्टेट में ऐसा नहीं है। यहाँ लिखा है कि जहां तक संभव है स्टेट को या तो इनइक्वालिटीज को मिनिमाइज करना है, एंड if it is possible the state should also eliminate inequality, but please mind the fact that eliminating inequality is totally antithetical to liberalism. क्योंकि लिबरलिज्म का कॉन्सेप्ट ही होता है कि इंडिविजुअल इज द प्राइमरी थिंग, नॉट द सोसाइटी. अगर कोई व्यक्ति किसी चीज में सबसे अच्छा है तो उसको अधिकार है उस अच्छाई के प्रोपोर्शन में रिसोर्सेस, पूंजी या ओहदे को एंजॉय करना. लेकिन अगर आप कहोगे कि आपके पास ज्यादा पूंजी है, आपके पास ज्यादा संसाधन है, आपके पास ज्यादा ओहदा है और ये लेके किसी और को दिया जाएगा जिससे आप दोनों समान आ जाओ, दिस इज बाय डेफिनेशन एंटीथेटिकल टू liberty. You see the point? That's the political science logic that we need to understand. And then of course we have thinkers who contest Marx and let's say Fabian etc. on one hand, and you have, you know, let's say Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau on the other end. You know, that's the material that you need to be able to churn to answer a question like this, to enrich the literature of that part. You see? So again we have a second point of reference. 38 clause 1 में लिखा हमने social justice है, 38 clause 2 में लिखा हमने reducing and eliminating inequalities is given as a directive principle of state policy. उसके बाद आप लिखेंगे article 39 B C. 39 B and C अगर आप देखेंगे तो one of the interpretation of 39 B and C again talk about socialism. समाज के उत्थान के लिए material resources को स्टेट उस तरह से मैनेज कर सकता है जिससे कि किसी एक व्यक्ति विशेष के हाथ में पूंजी ना आ जाए, एक व्यक्ति विशेष के हाथ में पूरे समाज के सारे आर्थिक संसाधनों का कंट्रोल ना आ जाए. नो, दिस इज अगेंस्ट लिबरलिज्म. प्लीज नोटिस, कैपिटलिज्म इज फंडामेंटली अ लिबरल आइडिया. लिबरल मतलब इंडिविजुअल के हाथ में अगर बहुत सारा पैसा है, धन है, संपत्ति है तो वो ठीक है, क्योंकि लिबरलिज्म ऑलवेज फॉलोज द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ इंडिविजुअलिज्म. तभी तो हम इकोनॉमिक थॉट में बोलते हैं नियो लिबरल इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी. मार्गरेट टैचर और रोनाल्ड रीगन के समय में जो रिफॉर्म्स लाए गए थे अमेरिका और इंग्लैंड में, उनको हम नियो लिबरल रिफॉर्म्स कहते थे कि स्टेट अपना समय, स्टेट इकोनॉमी को रेगुलेट करने में अपने आप को व्यस्त नहीं करेगा, इकोनॉमी को प्राइवेटाइज कर दिया जाए और इकोनॉमी अपने आप को खुद संभाल लेगी. स्टेट हैज नो बिजनेस ऑफ बीइंग इन बिजनेस. A kind of a Reaganite and a Thatcherite outlook of the neoliberal economic system. Now you see, neoliberal has liberal in it, and neoliberal economic idea promotes capitalism. This idea is against capitalism. Capitalism means concentration of wealth. This idea talks about the fact that state can take wealth from the hands of a person who has concentration of that wealth and distribute it in the masses. Right? You see the opposition? That's the point that you need to understand. देखिए इसको 39 B and C को. Ownership and control and the material resources of the community are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. And the operation of economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production to the common. Do you see the point? What I'm trying to make? अब आपके पास कितना सारा मटेरियल आ गया. देखिए, इससे अच्छा उत्तर आप इसका लिख ही नहीं सकते किसी भी तरीके से. आपने इंट्रोडक्शन, अगेन इफ आई वांट टू जस्ट डू इट so that you are able to catch up with what I'm doing over here. And please forgive me if I'm slightly rushing, because we want to give only a sense of what we'll do in the classroom. In the classroom, of course, we'll take as much time as it is to your satisfaction, so that you can get a very clear understanding of how this has to be understood. How far do you agree that DPSP are more fundamental than fundamental rights in meeting the socio-economic justice as mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution? कैसे डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी सोशो इकोनॉमिक जस्टिस के लिए ज्यादा महत्वपूर्ण है वनस्पत फंडामेंटल राइट्स? ये प्रश्न है आपका. ठीक है, इंट्रोडक्शन में आपने क्या लिखा? इंट्रोडक्शन में आपने डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ फंडामेंटल राइट्स को एक तरह से इनिशिएट कर दिया. फंडामेंटल राइट्स पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी कॉन्सेप्ट लिबरलिज्म, directive principle political theory concept socialism, political thinkers associated with these ideas. That's your introduction. And then when you come to the body, you do nothing but write down the relevant keywords to elaborate that point. Fundamental rights is liberalism. These are the thinkers. These are the articles of the Constitution. 14, 19, 21, all individualistic articles. All what you can call articles with regard to giving an individual the emancipation against the society, right? And then if you take a look at this part of directive principles of state policy, then you cite the articles. Preamble talks about social economic justice. 38 clause 1, social justice. 38 clause 2, reducing or eliminating inequalities. 39 B and C, concentration of material wealth should not happen in a manner in which it is determinant of the common good, right? And the resources, the material resources of the community should be so distributed as to subserve the common good, communism. You see, it's not very difficult to make these correlations once you understand the logic of how this is happening. That's the point of a classroom like this. You see? Now, just to give a final touch to this answer, you can have a current update point on this. As I was giving you a sense, just let me pull this one out 1 second. This is the final touch on what we can do. You see, this is the judgment which has been given by the Supreme Court recently. If you have any, recent, interaction with current updates, you have seen how the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court has given this particular judgment. This is just a very simple, headline of the judgment. Nature of private property. Judgment pronounced material resources under Article 39B does not include all private property. Just take a look at the magnitude of this development. Today, a 9-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court held that not all privately owned property is material resources of the community under Article 39B of the Constitution, putting rest to a long pending case. 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court. Constitution benches, I'm sure some of you are aware, attended the polity classes or otherwise covered subject of the Constitution. 5, 7, 9. 9 is pretty heavy. Okay. That judgment, if you write Property Owners Association versus State of Maharashtra as a current update upon this answer, what I mean to say basically is, एक बार आपका आंसर यहाँ तक आ गया, you are able to give the relevant articles of the Constitution of India. Okay, and then towards the end of the body part, if you write the judgment of the Supreme Court in the Property Associations of Maharashtra versus Union of India, saying that recently the Supreme Court has pronounced judgment on the same subject matter as to should the Constitution be interpreted, please notice, as a liberal constitution or as a collectivist constitution. This is what the Supreme Court said, that it is neither liberal nor collectivist by its own nature, but it is from time to time and need to need that the nature of the constitution can be determined by the parliament. But I will not go into the details of what I'm saying right now. I'm just giving you a sense of a very simple idea. But if you write this judgment by the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court, that is going to be the cherry on top to be able to cover the answer like this. Do you see the point, class? Now see, how else can you write a better answer to this? How do you say, question kya bolta hai? Directive principle of state policies are better and more relevant and more important in terms of achieving socio-economic justice than the fundamental rights. The question, explain, elaborate, comment, that's the point. Okay, now how do you write it? Introduction, liberalism, socialism, fundamental rights, directive principle of state policy. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, Ambedkar. It's all of this is basically it. Then after that you come to the body part and you see the points in the Constitution which say fundamental rights are liberal in character and directive principles of state policy are socialistic or collectivist in character, right? 21, 14, 19, 39A, 39B and C, Article 38, Clause 1 and 2. And then you write the judgment of the Supreme Court. And then you conclude. And there is also a way of concluding, but I don't want to go into it right now. Of course, you can say in conclusion that it is not necessary that socialism is only propounded by directive principles or fundamental rights are the only protector of liberal ideas. You can give examples like right to education is a liberal idea which is taken from directive principle of state policy and fundamental rights both. So this kind of a what you can call polarity कि fundamental rights ये करते हैं और directive principle ये करता है, ये हर समय सही नहीं रहती है. There is some kind of a harmony between them. And there you can give the example of what is known as a doctrine of harmonious construction. The Supreme Court has given that particular point. So that way you can conclude. Now this is a power-packed answer. If you write an answer like this, nothing will go wrong. That is a short. I don't have to give you this as a, as a pronouncement. आपको खुद ही लगेगा कि इस question में और इससे अच्छा answer आप क्या लिख सकते हैं. What else can you add at this stage? Write an answer of a question like this. It is full of keywords, it is full of articles of the Constitution, it is full of a doctrine of the Supreme Court, and it is also giving a sense of the current updates upon a subject matter. What else do you really have in mind to be able to answer a question like this? That is exactly what we would want to take into account while we are preparing our classrooms. Every question in the last 5 years, we'll do an anatomy of exactly in the same manner. And that is in addition to the classrooms. Okay, in the classrooms, we'll develop the concepts and then we'll run these concepts in terms of their relevance and accuracy by answering these questions. There are enough previous year questions for us to test whether we are able to apply these concepts into answer writing, but also I will give a set of different questions for you to be able to complete this together in a collective manner. That is what we basically intend to do in a classroom session. So I'm just giving a simple hint of what the classroom sessions are supposed to be in terms of understanding these ideas from a fundamental conceptual perspective, and then also to be able to use the material which is available to us from current updates, from history, from the Constitution of India, from the judgments of the Supreme Court, and put this material in answer writing along with the spinal cord of political theory ideas. That's the complete package in terms of answer enrichment, and that we will be able to achieve 100%. That is not a doubt that I have. I am very sure and I'm very certain that that kind of a excellence and credibility we can develop inside a classroom in terms of reflecting those points in the answers, right? So that's one of the ways in which I think we can get a sense of what we are up to in this part. Right, let me show you another question which has, I'm just doing a bit of a demo session over here, so just going to another question on the same category. Let's take a look at this question. This is 2021. Coming to section B, now take a look at this one. Same topic, the relationship between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Take a look at this question. Now, the topic is same, but the question is slightly different. So you'll have to modify the literature. जो आपने पढ़ा है इसके बारे में, उसको थोड़ा modify करके इसमें present करना पड़ेगा. Take a look at the question. Constitutionally reconciling the fundamental rights with the directive principles of state policy has led to frequent amendments of the Constitution and judicial interventions. Now, of course, I will require maybe 1.5 hours to explain to you the 1970s to be able to come to this question. Right? क्या बोलते हैं? The Constitution reconciling the fundamental rights and the directive principle of state policy has led to frequent amendments of the Constitution and judicial interventions. ठीक है, बहुत अच्छा प्यारा क्वेश्चन. Amendments, अब देखिए इसमें आप थोड़ा सा भाई देखिए सिंपल एक लॉजिक बनाते हैं. What does this question talk about? Let's see. First, it talks about a battle of ideas, or not a battle, but what you can say, a dynamism of ideas. Liberalism and again socialism. Right? What else is the battle over here? Battle between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Right? But what else is a battle over here? Battle between the parliament and the Supreme Court. Because you see, it says constitutionally reconciling the fundamental rights with directive principles of state policy has led to frequent amendments to the Constitution. Now, who amends the Constitution? Please, class. Who amends the Constitution? Parliament. And judicial interventions. Which institution has the capacity of intervening in the acts of the Parliament? The judiciary, the Supreme Court. You see, so what am I putting it? Liberalism versus socialism. Fundamental rights versus directive principles of state policy. Parliament versus the Supreme Court. But this versus is not a battle, but a kind of a dynamism, a kind of a give and take. Some battle, but some cooperation, step by step. They try to balance everything out, but also there are certain, differences. That is what we have to lay out in a subject like this. You see, and you have, once you realize the connection between amendments, which is made by the Parliament, and judicial interventions, which are made by the Supreme Court, you have an opening into so much literature that you can use. Obviously, we're talking about the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution under Article 368, which you can write over here, and also the Keshwananda Bharati judgment, in which the Supreme Court invented the basic structure doctrine, that part of the Constitution, which says that the Parliament's power to amend the Constitution is not infinite. If the Supreme Court wants, it can strike down the amendments made to the Constitution by the Parliament if those amendments are violating the essence of the Constitution. And that essence of the Constitution is what we understand as the basic features of the Constitution, or the basic structure doctrine. See the point? So all of a sudden you have this point that you can write directly once you are able to make that kind of a connection. That's how, once you get a sense of that in the classroom, of how these things are connected, that is what is the most important part of this preparation. Right? And then once, of course, we have discussed this in the class, we'll have a set of notes which we can write, memorize those notes, look at a question, write the answers, and do this again, so that a cycle is instilled in your mind and you have a muscle memory to be able to produce these points at any kind of a initiation. You don't have to think too much before writing. You already know that this is something that you are conditioned with, you are exercised with, you're memorized with. That is what we try to do in the classroom. That is where the classroom program has to come at the central point of this preparation. That's what basically I offer you. You see, so let's take a look at this point slightly more properly. You understand that this is a session that some of us have taken in the Constitution class also, but we know that for a fact that there are certain points which we remember in this part. Let's say you have, let's say for example, the fundamental rights on one hand and directive principle of state policy on the other hand. That's how we can create a synopsis of a question like this, right? So what happens over here? Fundamental rights में हम क्या लिखते हैं? जैसे for very simply, आपको पता है कि लैंड रिफॉर्म्स के बारे में बात शुरू हुई थी। बात थी लैंड रिफॉर्म्स की। लैंड रिफॉर्म्स का क्या मतलब होता है? मतलब ये होता है कि भारत जब आजाद हुआ था तो उस समय जमींदारी सिस्टम, परमानेंट सेटलमेंट के द्वारा जो लैंड ओनरशिप का जो सीन था, उसके हिसाब से एक व्यक्ति के पास, जमींदार, जागीरदार इत्यादि, उनके पास पूरे लैंड की अपने ऊपर ओनरशिप और कंट्रोल था, है ना? ये आपको पता है, दिस इज अ हिस्टोरिकल फैक्ट। अब आजादी के बाद जो भारत की सरकार का, मतलब पहली जो सरकार बनी थी भारत की आजादी के बाद, उसका सबसे बड़ा जो एक आश्वासन था लोगों को, वो ये था कि हम जो जमींदारी और जागीरदारी के सिस्टम्स के आधार पर जो भूमि का कंसंट्रेशन कुछ लोगों के हाथ में आ गया है, जिन लोगों ने शोषण किया है, जिन लोगों ने एक्सप्लॉइटेशन किया है, उसको हम रद्द कर देंगे। मतलब बेसिकली दे वांटेड टू इन अ वे undo what is known as the land ownership systems and processes in India। तो उसके लिए आपको लैंड रिफॉर्म लाने थे। लेकिन अगर आप ये देखें कि आप एक तरफ लैंड रिफॉर्म लाना चाहते हैं, दूसरी तरफ आपके पास फंडामेंटल राइट्स का फ्रेमवर्क है, जहां पर आपने देखा है कि आर्टिकल 14 है, आर्टिकल 19(1)(f) उस समय फंडामेंटल राइट था, जिसको हम राइट टू प्रॉपर्टी कहते हैं। अब एक तरफ आपके पास आर्टिकल 39 है या आर्टिकल 38 है। 39 बी और सी में आपने देखा, मटीरियल रिसोर्सेज ऑफ द सोसाइटी कैन नॉट बी डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड सो टू बी इन डेट्रीमेंट ऑफ द कॉमन गुड। मतलब मटीरियल रिसोर्सेज को आप उस तरह से नहीं छोड़ेंगे जिससे कि लोगों का किसी प्रकार का अन्याय हो, समाज के जो मासेस हैं उनका अन्याय। कॉन्सेंट्रेशन ऑफ वेल्थ ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए जिससे कि सिर्फ कुछ लोगों को फायदा हो लेकिन अधिक लोगों का किसी प्रकार का शोषण हो। ये नहीं कर सकते, ये संविधान में दे रखा है 39 बी और सी में। 38 में आपने देखा है क्लॉज 1 और क्लॉज 2 में आपने देखा है कि सोशल जस्टिस और इनइक्वालिटी के अगेंस्ट बातें रखी। तो यहाँ पर स्टेट के पास पावर है कुछ स्टेप्स उठाने की, है? स्टेट आपको पता है, इट इज something which is defined under Article 12 of the Constitution, and state includes the Parliament and the Government of India। State का मतलब होता है Parliament और Government of India। पर वहीं दूसरी तरफ आपने मौलिक अधिकारों के हिसाब से जमींदारों को भी फंडामेंटल राइट्स दे रखी है कि जिसके पास प्रॉपर्टी है वो अपनी प्रॉपर्टी को ओन कर सकता है, इट इज अ फंडामेंटल राइट। आर्टिकल 14 में आपने ये दे रखा है कि किसी व्यक्ति के संग भेदभाव नहीं किया जाएगा, मतलब किसी की प्रॉपर्टी अगर ज्यादा है तो उससे लेके किसी और को नहीं दे दी जाएगी। दिस इज एन इनइक्वालिटी, a kind of inequality which is given under Article 14 of the Constitution। तो you are very clearly looking at confrontation, conflict, कि जहां पर सरकार एक तरफ लैंड रिफॉर्म्स करना चाहती थी इन संविधान के आर्टिकल्स के अंदर, उसी तरफ उसी संविधान के कुछ आर्टिकल्स के अंदर लैंड रिफॉर्म्स नहीं किया जा सकता था, कि जैसे ही आप लैंड रिफॉर्म का कोई लॉ बनाएंगे और किसी की प्रॉपर्टी जब्त कर लेंगे, वो व्यक्ति उस लॉ को लेके सुप्रीम कोर्ट के सामने चला जाएगा ये कहने के लिए कि मेरी प्रॉपर्टी को जबरन जब्त करना मेरी फंडामेंटल राइट 19(1)(f) का वायलेशन है। यू अंडरस्टैंड द इनहेरेंट प्रॉब्लम इन डूइंग something like land reforms? And of course we will later on tell you what was the role of Jawaharlal Nehru and the entire edifice of the Congress party, what was the political outlook in 1950s। राजनीति उस समय किस प्रकार की थी, जिस राजनीति के क्षेत्र में लैंड रिफॉर्म्स को रखा गया था, और लैंड रिफॉर्म्स एक बहुत बड़ा राजनीतिक मुद्दा था कांग्रेस की सरकार के सामने। और जवाहरलाल नेहरू की सेल्फ एस्टीम और प्रेस्टीज इस चीज पे टिकी हुई थी कि वो प्रधानमंत्री के पद पे बैठ के भारत के लोगों के बीच में जमीन को अपनाने के अधिकारों को बना सके। He wanted to be known as a prime minister who has solved the agrarian problem of India, not agrarian problem economically, but agrarian political problem, कि मतलब एग्रीकल्चरल लैंड की जो ओनरशिप का जो स्ट्रक्चर है भारत में, उसको मैं किस तरह से बदल सकता हूँ जिससे कि मैं भारत को एक प्रकार की समानता के तरफ लेके जाऊं या सामाजिक न्याय की तरफ लेके जाऊं। सो दिस इज द पॉलिटिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट स्टोरी दैट वी स्टडी 1950s में क्या हुआ था इस बारे में। तो यही हुआ था कि सरकार ने लॉज बनाए लैंड रिफॉर्म्स करने के लिए, उन लॉ को लेके व्यक्तियों ने सरकार के अगेंस्ट सुप्रीम कोर्ट में याचिका दायर कर दी कि सरकार फंडामेंटल राइट वायलेट कर रही है। पटना हाई कोर्ट के एक जज ने एक जजमेंट दे दिया जिसमें पटना हाई कोर्ट ने सरकार के इन लॉस को तोड़ दिया, ये कह के कि फंडामेंटल राइट के वायलेशन में है, आप ऐसे लॉ नहीं बना सकते। अ लॉ विच वायलेट्स अ फंडामेंटल राइट इज सपोज्ड टू बी स्ट्रक। ठीक है, अब उसी से एक तरह की सरकारी बहस शुरू हो गई, जहां पर आपको पता है कि यू हैव द फर्स्ट कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंडमेंट एक्ट 1951, और इसी के साथ आपको पता है कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट का एक जजमेंट भी लगा हुआ है जिसका नाम है शंकरी प्रसाद। ये सारी चीजें शायद हमने पॉलिटी में करी होंगी, नहीं भी करी तो अभी ढंग से इसको कर लेंगे, अलग पर्सपेक्टिव से इसको करेंगे। उसी तरह से फिर बाद में और आते रहे, यू हैव लेट्स से उसके बाद जब चीज़ें थोड़ी असाधारण हो गई तो आपके पास सुप्रीम कोर्ट के और जजमेंट्स आने लगे। इस जजमेंट्स में एक फहरिस्त है, गोलकनाथ का जजमेंट है, उसके बाद आपका जजमेंट आता है केशवानंद भारती का। अब यहाँ पर अमेंडमेंट की ही बात हो रही है कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, और इसी के साथ लगे हुए अमेंडमेंट्स कौन से हैं, 24th और 25th कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंडमेंट एक्ट है 1971 का। सिमिलरली 42nd कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंडमेंट एक्ट है 1976 का। और इन सब टेक्निकल डिटेल्स के पीछे कुछ पॉलिटिकल पॉइंट्स। क्या पॉलिटिकल पॉइंट्स? एक तरफ पार्लियामेंट और स्टेट करना चाहते थे सोशलिज्म, और दूसरी तरफ सुप्रीम कोर्ट was trying to present it as a liberal idea. ये आपकी पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी का पॉइंट हो गया। एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स यू हैव अदर लिटरेचर, आर्टिकल 368, पावर ऑफ द पार्लियामेंट टू अमेंड द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, एंड द बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर डॉक्ट्रिन, द लिमिटेशन ऑन द पावर ऑफ द पार्लियामेंट टू amend the constitution. You see, and now of course I'm not taking an entire classroom for this, but I'm just kind of inviting you to take a look in the process by which a person who is able to understand these ideas by using the history, by using the political theory, by using the provisions of the constitution, by using the judgments of the Supreme Court, is able to produce all this literature and then present it in an answer format. And it is possible, 100% it is possible. You see, this is not something that you have to take years and years of training to do. You don't. The moment you understand this in a more or less conceptual manner, and if you have a set of notes in front of you, then it is easy for you to be able to memorize those notes, look at a question and answer. You see, you don't have to go through years and years of training for this, like academics do. Just a little bit of a conceptual understanding with the right amount of literature and an ability to write answers frequently can get you to the point where you can write these answers exactly in the questions as they're asked. Right? So, yeah, just take a look at the data that I have spread out on the board in comparison to the question which has been asked. पढ़िए प्रश्न को एक बार। अब I know कि अभी हम इसकी स्ट्रक्चरिंग ढंग से नहीं कर पा रहे because we are not in that mode, but you be sure that is very simple and easy to do. Constitutionally reconciling the fundamental rights with the directive principles of state policy has led to frequent amendments of the constitution and judicial interventions. आप तोड़ के देखिए। Reconciling मतलब दोनों के बीच में समन्वय बिठाना। Reconciling उन्हीं चीजों का होता है जो कि फंडामेंटली एक दूसरे से विपरीत होती है। तो आपको पता है कि यहाँ पर फंडामेंटल राइट्स और डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल ऑफ स्टेट पॉलिसी के बीच के टेंशन और कोऑपरेशन को थोड़ा सा बताना है ना। लेड टू फ्रीक्वेंट अमेंडमेंट्स। मैंने आपको बताया था यहाँ पर अमेंडमेंट कौन करता है? पार्लियामेंट। अमेंडमेंट क्यों होते हैं? क्योंकि पार्लियामेंट फंडामेंटल राइट्स को थोड़ा सा छोटा करने के लिए डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल्स को बड़ा करना चाहते हैं। जैसे हम 31C, 31A, B और C को देखेंगे तो ये अमेंडमेंट हुए थे। 21st, 24th और 25th कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंडमेंट और 42nd कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंडमेंट में 31A, B, C लगाए गए थे, जिसमें कि फंडामेंटल राइट्स को DPSP से थोड़ा इंफीरियर कर दिया गया था। और फिर इनमें से काफी सारे अमेंडमेंट सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने तोड़ दिए थे, क्योंकि उनके हिसाब से फंडामेंटल राइट्स डीपीएसपी से ऊपर नहीं हो सकती है। तो इन तोड़ने को क्या बोलते हैं? जुडिशियल इंटरवेंशन। और उसी के साथ आपका बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर का भी क्वेश्चन है, क्योंकि जुडिशियल बॉडीज के पास पार्लियामेंट के द्वारा किए हुए संशोधनों को तोड़ने की पावर कहाँ से आती है? तो वो आती है केशवानंद भारती के जजमेंट से, जो कि बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर डॉक्ट्रिन का इन्वेंशन है। तो अगेन, विदाउट गोइंग इनटू द स्ट्रक्चरल adherence to a logic, I am only trying to communicate to you a point of order by which you can produce this entire literature in the forefront of your mind upon looking at a question like this, and organize this information into an answer. That is what we intend to achieve as an objective in these classroom sessions, right? So this is just one of the ways in which I am, in a way, introducing to you the methodology and the pedagogy by which we are going to conduct the classrooms on this part. And of course, we have 3 more demo sessions. Today I have taken one part of the subject, which is dealing with fundamental rights, constitution, etc. But please don't be under the impression that I am doing it because I am also teaching constitution. Tomorrow I'll take a more exciting and a much more passionate part for me, which is political theory. More than fundamental rights and directive principle of state policy, I've always been very fascinated by political thinkers and thoughts. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Gramsci, Marx, Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli. So tomorrow, just like we did a demo on this part, we're going to do a demo on one of the few questions on a political thinker. Maybe I'll choose a political thinker. Maybe we can do Thomas Hobbes and the related questions from Thomas Hobbes, or we can choose Machiavelli, or we can choose Marx, or we can choose Gramsci, Hannah Arendt. Let's see what we take it. But tomorrow we'll do a similar demo session on political theory, and in the remaining 2 demo classes we'll take up international political theory, for example a neoliberal view or a post-colonial view, and in the last demo class we'll take a issue from contemporary international relations of India and the world, how India is interacting with other countries. So I want to take each class into giving you a demonstration of how each part of the subject can be dealt with in terms of its relevance with the subject of the political science. Okay, now this is where I am going to end. We have 5 minutes before we complete the scheduled time. I'm sorry, we're trying to set up a studio here, so we had to start up late, but we're going to get rid of all the technical glitches within one day, and then we will have a streamline proper in terms of that. So if you have any questions, I can read you on the chat box, and if you have any questions you can ask them now, or we can meet together tomorrow for the second demo. Any kind of a technical question that you have about the course, etc., I'll announce it in the class tomorrow. What is the duration of the course, what is included in the course, test series, personal mentorship, etc., etc. So we'll take a look at those technical details tomorrow. But if you have any overall questions, if you have questions from the class that we took yesterday, right now, you can have a bit of a throwing up of them right now. Otherwise we can conclude. So Akshay says no questions. Jatin says if there are any, what is the modality of the course? The initial is going to be online because we are like a few sometimes we are going to make it online. But for students who are in Delhi, or I would request, do you want to have directly? Better. So till we are able to make it offline and viable in that sense, we are going to make sure that we have a set of personal interfaces by which we can meet each of you in a one-on-one basis in a offline setting, but also on a Zoom call or a conference we can talk to each other if you're not able to. Take a Okay, I think there was some audio issue. Right. So, okay, I'm just going to repeat this once again. Primarily online. But in addition to being online, we have the facility of office hours, which means that at a particular date and time, you can come and visit me in my office for a personal interaction, one-on-one in a physical setting, as to whatever doubts you may have or whatever guidance you may need. So I would be available offline outside the classroom, and in addition to the classroom, I am located in New Delhi, so you can visit my office, and in those hours we can have a personal discussion as to how your preparation has to be given a particular understanding. For people who are not in Delhi and who want to speak to me personally, we can arrange a Zoom call or a conference in which we can speak to each other. So the idea is to give a personal touch, to give a personal push to what we are discussing. Anyway, the classroom is going to be not very big, so we are deliberately trying to keep the size of the classroom small so that it can become a customized and a personalized experience, and all your doubts and queries can be addressed. But in addition to that, if you want to speak to me personally offline, I would be available. For people who cannot be in Delhi, I would be available online, personally, privately. And in completion of the syllabus, we're going to do it entirely, majoritarily, online for the part of at least the first batch. Maybe in the later times we can have an offline setting if we are able to find that viable. Okay. Slightly special and even personal. So my gratitude to you for showing up. Thank you so much. Hope to see you tomorrow.